Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Blond Knight of Germany, Chapter 18, Release. Life is a whole, and good and ill must be accepted together. Winston Churchill. Erich's intuition during the last year of his confinement that the ordeal was coming to an end had a foundation in real events that lay outside his direct knowledge. Moves were afoot on his behalf back in Germany. His mother's letters to Stalin and Molotov went unanswered and unacknowledged, extinguishing all hope of help from that direction, but conditions in 1954 were changing radically for the better in Germany. This enabled Erich Hartmann to approach another significant personality, and this time to evoke a human response. 9 years after the end of the war, the recovery of Germany was well advanced. With her people working industriously to rebuild shattered cities and erect new factories, with German industry going full blast and export markets expanding, the country was creating an economic miracle and taking its place again in the human family. Recovery brought with it a strengthening and revitalizing of the body politic, and these processes saw the emergence of the most significant figure in postwar Germany, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. Frau Elisabeth Hartmann wrote to the leader of her country and asked his assistance in securing the release of her son. Chancellor Adenauer received her letter and replied personally. He held out the hope that positive steps in winning Erich's freedom might be taken in the coming months and stated that the German government was deeply concerned about the prisoners. This kind letter did much to alleviate a mother's grief, made all the more acute by her widowhood. Thereafter, Adenauer became something of a hero in her eyes. Der Alte was as good as his word. When he went to Moscow to reach a general settlement and trade agreement with the Soviet Union, the question of POWs still in Russia was in the forefront of his mind. At least 16,000 men were still imprisoned to a certain knowledge of the Bonn government, and unofficial estimates ranged as high as 100,000 men illegally detained. A traditionalist and a decent man, Dr. Adenauer felt the return of ex-soldiers held for a decade was a mandatory Russian concession. Eager for a rapprochement with research in Germany, the Russians saw that the time had come to use the prisoners as a bargaining fulcrum. As part of the general settlement, the Soviet Union agreed to release prisoners of war held since 1945. Erich Hartmann's name was cited as one of the individuals whose return was desired by the German government. Guards at the Novocherkassk jail told the prisoners about Adenauer's visit, and scraps of news that appeared about the role of POWs in negotiations led to wild rumors among the prisoners. The Russian bureaucracy began to move after the agreements were signed in Moscow. Chancellor Adenauer's request for his release was eventually transmuted into an order Erich received from a Russian guard. Report to Building 5 for clothing issue. He was given some new clothes, roughly tailored and baggy, but infinitely superior to prison garb. Years of dashed hopes and shattered dreams had conditioned Erich against thinking too strongly about his release. This was something different. New clothes were of no use in prison. When the Russian camp commandant invited Erich and other prisoners to enjoy the camp cinema, the whole thing seemed too good to be true, and they declined his offer. Despite his suspicions, Erich allowed himself the luxury of thinking that release was imminent. Back in Germany, Usch was having similar thoughts. Her hopes for Erich's early return had been fortified first by Dr. Adenauer's letter to Erich's mother, and then by the German leader's Moscow visit. Newspapers in the Federal Republic extolled Adenauer's achievements in the Moscow meeting, and Germany was assured that its long-lost sons were coming home. A Pravda release published in Germany said that the prisoners had been granted a general amnesty. Then came formal notification from the Bonn government that Erich would be released. The days flitted by, and Usch's hopes became interlaced with occasional disquieting doubts. A returning prisoner who had been briefly with Erich told Usch that he would not be released because he was a war criminal. The man went on his way after making Usch miserable. She waited on, hardly able to bear the mounting tension. 2 days after drawing his new clothes, Erich was told to bag his few belongings and prepare to leave camp. The prisoners were lined up outside the barracks, and the commandant shook hands and wished them luck, expressing the hope that there would be no more wars. A grubby bus took Erich to Rostov, where he transferred to a train that would carry him home. Boarding the train, he went wild with excitement inside. Home, Usch, the family, it was almost too much to believe. There was a lump in his throat, but outside he stayed unruffled, even if obviously happy. With 50 other prisoners, he sat back contentedly on the hard seats, and as the train rumbled away from Rostov, his thoughts turned momentarily from home to a rail journey of 10 years ago. He still could hardly believe that he was finally reversing the journey in the jam-packed cattle car that took him to the swamp hell at Kirov. As the train rolled through Voronezh, Stalinogorsk, Moscow and Bryansk and kept rattling westward, the reality of the experience began to take hold. All week long, his heart sang as the Russian countryside passed in flat panorama. As they lurched across eastern Poland to Brest-Litovsk and then entered the new state of East Germany, the click-clack of the wheels sounded like the music of deliverance. The train crossed the border into the Federal Republic of West Germany, and Erich saw the station sign. Herleshausen. He was free. With border formalities quickly completed, Erich got out of the train and pushed his way through the platform crowd to a specially established Red Cross office. To a pretty German girl behind the counter, he dictated his first free telegram in nearly 11 years. Dear Usch, I have crossed the border today into Germany. Wait at home until I come. Love, your Erich. 2 hours later, Usch was reading the wire, her eyes filled with tears. The unprepossessing yellow telegraph form held the most wonderful message she had ever received. He was free, and he was coming home. Usch's mother shared her tears of joy. They telephoned Erich's mother in Weil, and there were more happy tears. Word of Erich's release and imminent arrival home soon spread all over Weil and Stuttgart. The POW welcoming committee on the station platform at Herleshausen had warm words for everyone. The burgomaster of the town gave a short address of welcome. Newspapermen were running back and forth recalling half-forgotten names like Erich Hartmann and those of other prominent soldiers due for repatriation. In pathetic counterpoint to the joy were the plaintive and searching inquiries after missing men. Sad-faced women waved photographs and asked the prisoners if they knew anything about husbands and fathers swallowed into the Soviet prison system a decade ago. The POW organization had planned a big reception for Erich Hartmann on his return to Stuttgart. Almost 1,000 people were expected to attend, including high figures in public life. The representatives rattled on about the arrangements for the celebration. Erich held up his hand to still the flood of talk. Please, he said, there must be no reception. I cannot agree to any kind of celebration. Newspapermen clustered around the Blond Knight, sensing a story. They all wanted to know why he would decline a reception in his honor after almost 11 years away from his country. Because the Russians view life differently from us. They might decide, on hearing or reading of such a celebration, not to release any more German prisoners. I know the Russian secret police well enough to be fearful on this account for the continued imprisonment of my countrymen in the Soviet Union. When they are all home, then we will have the celebration. Meanwhile, we must not rest until all German soldiers imprisoned in Russia are repatriated. He thanked the Burgermeister and the POW committee for their kindness and stepped aboard a bus for the final leg of the trip, which would end with clearance through the POW center at Friedland. As the countryside rolled past the bus windows, he reflected with alternating contentment and awe on his return to his native land. That was Germany out there. He had to keep assuring himself that he wasn't in a dream about paradise. How green and vitally alive his country looked. People appeared markedly different from what he remembered. Clothing shapes and styles were completely changed. The hundreds of shiny cars he saw along the roads were like glittering artifacts from another planet. Times had changed. Germany was a new land. He felt a keen and living affinity with the legend of Rip Van Winkle, except that while the mythical figure slept, he had lived a nightmare. At Friedland, a familiar smiling face appeared out of the crowd. Hans Asi Hahn, a fellow prisoner from Gliazovets days. Asi had got word of Erich's return. Fat and prosperous, Asi pumped Erich's hand and insisted that he must come to his nearby home. He could telephone Usch from there, and then Asi would personally drive him home to Stuttgart. This impromptu arrangement cut across family plans to get Erich home to Usch with minimum delay. Even as Asi Hahn collected him at Friedland, Erich's brother Alfred and a boyhood friend named Helmut Werner were speeding northward in another car to drive the Blond Knight home. His telephone call to Usch from Assi Hahn's place was almost a disaster. After he told her where he was, Usch, who had been waiting for him nearly 11 years, got a little excited. At Assi Hahn's place? What in the world are you doing there when I'm here? In a few hours, Erich was racing on to Stuttgart with Helmut Werner and Alfred after they collected him from the celebrant atmosphere at Hahn's place. Every glance out the car window brought something new to Erich's mind. Germany was like a new civilization. The drabness of the war years had gone. Colors on signs and colored clothing on the people seemed nothing short of dazzling after 10 years in jails. They drove on all through the night, and the communist neon sign seemed to Erich as though it had been transported directly from fairyland. Usch had gone to bed on Saturday night knowing that Erich would be home the next day, although the time of his arrival was indefinite and depended on road conditions. Already she had forgiven him for his diversion to Assi Hahn's place. She was in a fever of anticipation. Fitful snatches of sleep were interspersed with constant clock watching. She was dozing around 4 a.m. when the telephone bell shattered the silence. Usch leapt 2 feet clear of the bed and grabbed the instrument. Usch? Erich, where are you? We're in Frankfurt. We've stopped here for coffee. Should be there in a couple of hours or so. The tension of the ensuing hours was almost unendurable for Usch. She got up and lay down in innumerable restless cycles. The hands of the clock moved with tortuous slowness as dawn came. She had dropped into a light doze when she heard a gentle knocking. When she sat up, the knocking stopped. For a moment, she thought she was hearing things. Then the knock sounded again. Usch ran to the window, flung it open and leaned out, craning over to see the front door below. Someone was there, not fully visible. Erich? She called softly. The figure moved into full view, looking up at her. The hair was as blonde as ever, the eyes looked even bluer than she remembered. The face was gaunt, and the wiry body incredibly thin. He smiled, and her heart leapt. Herr Erich had come home. For a tender, numbing instant they looked at each other without speaking. Usch broke the silence. Erich, our love is as though you've never been away. Erich's tongue came free a moment later. You look good, he said. He was at a loss for words. Usch dashed to the front door, and in a moment they were in each other's arms. Love, faith, and trust had won through. The great challenge had been met and conquered. For both of them it was an unforgettable moment as they clung together in a mutual outpouring of joy that took away their breath and speech. Usch's parents joined briefly in the reunion, overwhelmed that their daughter's long vigil had not been in vain, and tearfully happy that Erich had survived to take up life again. Erich telephoned his mother, and then there was the supernal luxury of a hot bath. After that, the lovers were left alone. The flooding sweetness of physical love lost to their lives for a decade, inundated and swept away their bitter yearnings on a rolling tide of fulfillment. If nirvana has ever come among the earthly, it came that morning to Erich and Usch. Their bliss remained undisturbed for a little over 2 hours. Then a procession of well-wishers, friends and relatives began passing through the patch home. Happy men pumped Erich's arm, and their wives embraced him. Friends' children who had grown almost to adolescence without his seeing them were introduced to the heroic blond man. Flowers, gifts, and tokens of esteem jammed the living room and had to be stacked in adjoining rooms. Between 300 and 400 people milled into the house during the day, so that those closest to Erich had to be content with little more than snatches of conversation. Erich and Usch did not see each other alone again until after 10 p.m. In the next few days, Erich began to recover from the immediate exhaustion caused by his long trip out of Russia and the emotional excitement of reunion with his loved ones. After he had talked himself out with Alfred, his mother, Usch and her parents, and many friends who came to welcome him back, he was inwardly appalled by the way in which the last 10 years had evaporated. The warmth of hearth and home was like a healing balm that seemed to have annihilated the brutal decade. Now that I'm home, he said to Usch, it seems incredible that I was gone 10.5 years. What has happened to all that time? All those years? I feel the same way, Erich, just as though you had been gone a couple of weeks. The brutal decade had vanished into the limbo, gone forever, into the labyrinths of time, but it had left its marks on Erich. His brother Alfred had qualified as a medical doctor while Erich was in prison and had set up his practice in the same home and office on Bismarckstraße in Weil that their father had built on his return from China. When Alfred first saw Erich's physical condition, he blanched. The rugged, muscular athlete's body that Alfred knew so well had shriveled to barely 100 pounds. Erich's drawn face fairly reflected the ordeals of prison and the fight he had made to preserve his sanity and self-respect. Conversation quickly demonstrated to Alfred that his brother's mind and outlook were unimpaired. Said Dr. Alfred Hartmann of his time. His physical condition gave me a bad jolt initially, to what I saw in Erich on his return, and as a doctor, I was able to add my knowledge of him since childhood. The main thing to me was that he was unimpaired in mind. I well knew the strength of his constitution and his excellent recuperative powers. I knew that he would make a good recovery. The top priority task for Erich and Usch in rebuilding their lives together was to get Erich's bodily health and strength restored. He was in no condition to take up any commercial activity, so they decided to reverse the roles of husband and wife in the meantime. Usch kept her job at the post office in Stuttgart, and Erich put on an apron and shouldered the burdens of running the home. This decision helped phase him back into normal life after 10 years of total severance from ordinary civilized living. The most successful fighter pilot in the world describes his introduction to domesticity thus. Every morning I would get up and fix the breakfast. After Usch left for work on the 8 a.m. commuter train, I would wash the dishes, sweep the floor, make the beds, do the laundry, and generally straighten up the house. All of this I did just like a girl. Then I would go outside and work a while in the garden, tending the flowers, cutting the lawn, doing a little painting and other odd jobs, including building a wall. I learned to appreciate the wide range of chores our wives must do when we men go away to work. I would go shopping in the village and set a nice table, and at night I would wait at the door for Usch to come home. This period confirmed for me what I firmly believe to be the truth, that without Usch I am nothing. The simplest daily happenings were, for him, invested with magnetic charm. Like a child at Christmas time, he gawked into store windows. The sheer novelty of window shopping took weeks to lose its attraction. The glitter and color of beautiful new goods of all kinds fascinated and absorbed him. The taste of home-cooked food seemed more delicious than he could ever remember, even in his prison camp dreams of the outside world. He read voraciously, catching up on the world. The oldest magazines he found full of new information. He slept and dozed when not handling his household chores, and in barely perceptible increments the strength seeped back into his muscles, and firm flesh began to erase the main stigmata of the prisons. The restoration of a full and satisfying marital relationship after 10 years in an emotional desert brought him indescribable inner comfort. The psychic wounds were deeper than the emaciation of his body, but soon even these began to yield to a mode of living that had love at its core. The prison psychology, the behavioral habits forced on him during the prison decade, gave him many difficult moments in the first weeks at home. He was actually afraid to talk to people when he went shopping in the village or in other casual contacts. People in peacetime Germany thought differently from when he had last been home, and compared with POWs, their thought processes were wider and more versatile. The German people were also differently occupied from 10 years previously. These impressions united to give him the feeling at times that he had been reincarnated on another planet. The feeling that he was being watched persisted for several weeks. For more than 10 years he had done everything under the scrutiny either of Russian guards or of his fellow prisoners. There was a strong psychological barrier now to doing the most normal, everyday things because of his sense of presence and of all normal action being forbidden. One evening he was walking with Usch in Stuttgart, and they strolled past the ballroom. Music came floating out on the evening air, and couples with smiling faces were going in to dance. Dancing was something Erich and Usch had loved since the days of their 1939 dancing class trysts. Usch caught the mood and the memories in an instant. "Let's go in and dance, Erich." He wanted to go in, but something stopped him. He was physically blocked. The sensation was akin to being tongue-tied. He felt awkward, silly, and hung up. He could not force himself to go inside to dance, despite his overpowering desire to enjoy this pleasure with Usch. Since men of today captured in today's wars may come home similarly burdened, Erich Hartmann's experience of this post-prison adjustment period merits attention. His words also enjoy an understanding treatment of those who may have been decisively changed by their prison ordeals. He says, "This feeling that someone is watching you from behind, that you are denied and forbidden everything pleasant or human, is a haunting ordeal that not every ex-prisoner is able to conquer. With me, it lasted about 2 months. I believe I was lucky to throw it off, because it is basically a habit of mind that the years of prison routine literally build into your mental makeup. Other prisoners who were with me in Russia were not so lucky. I know this from meeting and talking with them. They are still in the grip of this prison psychology today, and because of it, cannot find a new beginning for themselves. These men are finished. I wish that some attention could be given to the tragic plight of some of these psychically disfigured individuals." At night comes the real horror. They are transported back in their dreams to those soul-crushing camps. They will never be free. Erich's recovery continued as warmth, kindness, and love worked their wonders. In November 1955, he and Usch took care of a long-delayed marriage detail. They added a church wedding ceremony to the courthouse proceeding of September 1944 in Bad Wiessee. Erich's uncle, Protestant pastor at Bopfingen, performed the ceremony. The wedding was a tender moment made all the more touching by the strength of the love that waited 10 years and won. Body and mind, Erich kept responding positively to the human warmth of Weil. His thoughts started turning increasingly to the question of his future. He began asking himself, in his 34th year, questions that men in ordinary times ask themselves before they are 20. He had to earn a living for himself and Usch, and there was a large challenge involved. He had to provide for the family they had decided to have in rebuilding their lives together. Had the war not intervened, Erich knew that he would in all probability have become a doctor like his father. He felt his father's death acutely as he pondered the problems of the future. His understanding counsel would have been welcome. Erich would have still liked to be a doctor after his return from prison, but he could add, and he was above all else, a realist. At 33, a demanding modern medical course would be a formidable undertaking even if all conditions were favorable. In his case, the reverse was true. He had been cut off from all academic pursuits for over 10 years, and even his high school chemistry and physics had grown dim in his memory. To think of being a doctor now was unrealistic. He felt the gaping void of the prison decade opening in him when he considered other things. 33 was late to start at any profession. For almost 1/3 of his total time on Earth, he had been in jail. His lack of business experience would handicap him not only in working for others, but also in setting up an enterprise of his own. He needed time to get in touch with commercial thinking, to feel its trends, grasp its substance, understand something of its methods. Meanwhile, the need to make a living was unrelentingly present. This critical period for Erich coincided with the active rebuilding of the German Air Force. Groundwork had begun several years previously in Chancellor Adenauer's office with old JG-52 aces Macki Steinhoff and Dieter Rabak, among others, doing the planning. The new force was gradually being built up around Germany's leading pilots and personalities from the Second World War. Barely 3 weeks after his return home, Erich got a taste of what was to come. The phone rang. Usch answered and handed the phone to Erich. "Walter Kropinski," she said. "Hi, Bubi," boomed the irrepressible Count Bunsky. "Gerd Barkhorn and I are leaving for a jet refresher course in England next week. Why don't you come with us? By the way, Bubi, how are you?" Erich put his hand over the mouthpiece and looked up at Usch with an expression of incredulity on his face. "God in heaven, Usch, he wants me to go on a flying course with him to England next week. He must be crazy." Kropinski was bellowing into the phone. "Bubi, where the hell have you gone?" "Krupi, damn it, I've been away in prison nearly 11 years and I haven't been home 3 weeks yet. I can't go to England or anywhere else until I feel better." "The hell you can't, Bubi, just take off. You'll feel better when you fly again, like in the old days." Kropinski was bubbling with enthusiasm, but it aroused none in Erich. "Krupi, call me when you get back. Tell me how flying was and about the new jets then, okay?" Kropinski hung up. He did telephone when he returned from England. So did other pilots who had joined or who were about to join the new Air Force. Kropinski's suggestion, originally outlandish, again crossed Erich's mind as the weeks went past. He also thought about old comrades who were flying again. None of these pilots like Kruppi, Gerd Brakhorn or Günter Rahl had been doing any flying while he was away in prison. They hadn't been in the military either, because there was no military. They had been forced into other things in the interim. The new Air Force was giving them a chance to use once more the skills, technical knowledge, experience and training that they had acquired as young men. They were fundamentally in the same spot as Erich, except that they were mostly pre-war professional officers and were older than he. One day, Erich found that he was quietly talking to himself as he used to in a tight spot in combat or when under pressure in prison. Erich, fighter piloting is all you know, the thing you're good at and do best. Maybe you should forget now that you don't like military life, just as you forgot it in 1940 when you had the chance to learn to be a pilot. This line of thought got some powerful reinforcement in the ensuing months. Persuasive and trusted people began urging Erich to rejoin the Air Force. His old Commodore from JG-52, Dieter Rabak, came to his home to make a personal appeal. Rabak had worked with Steinhoff on Air Force organization and had been to the USA for refresher training on jets. He outlined the Air Force in bright but realistic terms. There was a place for Erich and security as well. Hard on Rabak's heels came the Minister of Culture in the Adenauer government, Erich's one-time schoolteacher, Herr Simpfendörfer. With him came Herr Bench, a high official in the defense ministry in Bonn. This time, the pressure was heavier. You have to come back, Erich. We need you in the Air Force. Herr Bench was sincere and serious. You are the most successful fighter pilot in the world. You have the diamonds, and you are an important personality in the eyes of the young pilots we are going to train. You simply must come back to the service. Krupinski, Gerd Brakhorn and Günter Rahl all periodically telephoned or called to see him. Maki Steinhoff met Erich at Echterdingen Airport and used his considerable powers of persuasion. Paradise was never promised, but a good career and security could be offered with some certainty. As a sharply disappointing contrast to all these urgings, which emphasized his importance and value, nothing encouraging materialized from the world of commerce. As the months slid past, Erich felt he had to act, and the Air Force was offering him something familiar in which he had excelled. Life had to go on. Usch said nothing during these critical months to sway him one way or the other. He knew the decision was his alone, and that Usch would let it be a free decision. When he decided to rejoin the Air Force in late 1956, she accepted his judgment. She was disquieted nevertheless that Adolf Galland and the other living aces who had won the diamonds stayed out of the new Air Force. So did Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the famous Stuka pilot. When Erich went back into the service, he was the only officer in the new armed forces who had won the diamonds in the Second World War. Usch was not the only one who felt uneasy about Erich's decision. His brother Alfred had abiding regrets. Concerning this time, he says today, "I was sorry to see him continue in the military because I knew it was basically against his temperament. But the years of prison had exacted a terrible price. He was unable, at that time, to resume life adequately, except in the military." Erich Hartmann's rebirth would take place in the Air Force, where in his youth he had won immortality as a fighter. In his next phase of life, as in his youth and in the prison years, the Blond Knight would need his fighter's heart for the new kind of jousting that lay ahead. 10.5 years. That is almost 4,000 days in what was probably among the worst kinds of confinement to ever exist. And imagine, one day, finally, you're told to get your stuff, board a train, and go home. It's hard to even grasp the kinds and intensity of emotions going through your mind at this point, up to the moment you get back to your house. All the change you see along the way, all the differences that have happened in your 10 years of absence, and then just freedom. No one watching over you at all times, being able to do what you want whenever you want to. Again, I can't even begin to imagine what that must have felt like. You can spot glimpses of it in the face of our man in the photographs I put on screen during the episode. The story of how the prisoners were released is interesting in itself, and the book talks about it a bit. At the time, then Chancellor of the young West German Republic Konrad Adenauer traveled to Moscow to primarily negotiate diplomatic relations between his country and Russia under Nikita Khrushchev. His idea was to make these relations a conditional to the release of all remaining German POWs. Now, what he did not know at the time was that the Central Committee of the USSR had already decided to release the prisoners anyway. They were just waiting for a politically beneficial moment to do so. So, the bargaining chip Adenauer thought he had did in fact not exist. This gave the Russians most of the power in these negotiations, and they also knew that Adenauer was bluffing when he at one point threatened to cancel the negotiations and leave because his chancellorship was riding on the promise that he would have the prisoners released. Either way, in the end, a deal was reached and Adenauer got his prisoners while the Soviets got their diplomatic relations basically for free. Fun fact about these negotiations: among all the seriousness, Adenauer knew that true Russian politics were done at the dinner table and not in the office, so before attending the vodka-fueled benders each evening, he instructed his staff members to ingest 1 tablespoon of olive oil to soften the impact of the copious amounts of alcohol that were expected to be consumed. He wouldn't want anyone to appear to be soft during these events. In the event, everything worked out and all the POWs were released. This moment was called the Heimkehr der 10.000, the homecoming of the 10,000, which referred to the remaining 10,000 soldiers still in Soviet captivity. Adenauer was hailed as a hero among the people. As for Erich, he now had to adapt to life and work in post-war Germany, and even though he managed pretty well as a stay-at-home husband, once a warrior, always a warrior. But service in the new Luftwaffe would hold a very new set of challenges, and we will find out all about it in the next episode. Cheers.